The Blue White Breakdown. Bob Flounders, Johnny McGonigal. We are going to talk. We talked, Johnny. It's, as we get closer to spring, we've talked about your most important players list 1 through 25. We haven't actually finished that yet. We've had a couple other things to get to. It's been such a busy first couple of months of 2025 with the hiring of Jim Knowles and, the stadium renovation and the load seating, and the news is becoming fast and furious. But I think let's delve in to, as we get closer to spring, let's just take maybe a little bit more detailed look at who Penn State has added in the transfer portal and maybe what we think about them going into spring, what they need to do in spring. And we could also just talk about their success in the transfer portal. I think the last podcast we did together, we talked about Devontae Ross, the Troy wideout, the big play wideout, and maybe what he could mean for an offense that just has really been desperate for a playmaker at wideout. The last couple of years, it's cost them dearly in big games, whether it's regular season games against Ohio State and Michigan, or the Notre Dame semifinal loss. They've actually added a couple of wideouts. But let's just go through the list. We've talked a little bit about Devontae. We could still do that. We've talked about King Mack, the third-year safety who began his career at Penn State, spent last year at Alabama. But let's just dive into it, Johnny. When you look at the list, I'm just going to read them off at the start, and you can start with who you want to. So Devontae Ross, the receiver from Troy; Kyron Hudson, the wideout from USC, who Penn State's coaching staff and Penn State's beat got to see last year in Penn State's overtime thriller over USC last year; King Mack from Alabama; Owen Waffle, a defensive lineman from Michigan; TJ Shanahan, an offensive lineman from A&M, and maybe one of the more interesting players in the whole transfer portal class this year for Penn State is Eni White from A&M, just because of his potential, his background, his injury background, and where he really, he's a Pennsylvania kid. He was a star at Imhotep, right there, maybe right below Nick Singleton in the 2022 class. So that's the class. And Penn State's conversion rate on hitting in the transfer portal is impressive. But where do you want to start?
I'll start with the last guy that you mentioned, Eni White from Imhotep, from Texas A&M. As you mentioned, Bob, one of the highest rated recruits in the 2022 cycle. I think he was number 51, just on the fringe of the top 50 nationally. One of the best players from PA, one of the best players from the region. And it just didn't work out for him at Texas A&M. Injuries played a big factor in that. A&M, being a big portal team, bringing in guys and having really good defensive linemen as well. You look at some of the guys there, Shamar Stewart, Nick Skirton. And so it was a tough climb, for Eni White to make a real impact at A&M when he's dealing with, older players or, guys who they brought in via the transfer portal, getting playing time. And then also he's dealing with, injuries like this past season, a season-ending injury. So there's a lot of untapped potential there, And so I think in this transfer portal class overall, it's a good mix of like instant impact guys you think will come in right away and improve your team. Devontae Ross, Kyron Hudson, I think being the two big ones at the wide receiver position. At least that's what everyone is hoping for. But Eni White is on the other end, more of a kind of a project, but in a weird spot where he's an older guy. But he's still kind of like, you want him to do well, obviously, and you're taking a shot on the talent that you evaluated out of high school and the small, collection of tape he put on at A&M. But he's a super interesting guy, not just because of the talent, but the opportunity that he might have at defensive end with this group and the guys that they're losing.
Yeah, and also when you factor in, I hate to use the word need because of the way Penn State recruits and the way they develop, but when you lose three veteran players, one of them who could be the first pick in the draft in Abdul Carter, but even Smith Filbert, who's in the transfer portal, he had his moments last year. Vanover, really, I think on a lot of Big Ten teams, if you look at what Penn State's had at edge rusher the last 2 or 3 years, he would have been a starter, and he would have been, a much more, I guess, recognizable name nationally, because I think he would have started for a lot of Big Ten programs. But he was a guy I think that Penn State really liked, and he played a lot in the postseasons. But when you talk about Zariah Fisher, who they want him to have success, but much like Eni White, he's a guy that's had some injuries, some significant injuries that have just really set him back. You got to count on him. And then it's just a bunch of young players that you love, but they still need to do it. They still need the game reps. Penn State has a September schedule early that will allow that. But I think Eni White, I'm just really curious to see where he's at physically, and hopefully James Franklin maybe will update maybe kind of where he's at, what he's able to do. Can he possibly be somebody that in August might be close to full go? We're not going to know for a couple of weeks, but I think he's a pretty critical player. And I wanted to pivot to another critical player. We talked about Ross, but how about Kyron Hudson? I think if you're a Penn State fan, Johnny, you look at his stats at USC last year, and you're like, well, why did they add him? Well, in Lincoln Riley's offense, and we saw it out in Los Angeles, like they spread the ball around. Like there was no go-to wideout. They had a bunch of good wideouts, and they also used that running back, who was a terrific player in the passing game. So his numbers were probably not what they could have been at another school, but I think he's clearly talented, and Penn State needs all the help it can get at wideout. I think this guy, I don't want to say plug and play, but I do think that he should be right, if he's healthy, right at near the top of the depth chart. If he can just kind of replicate what he did last year at USC.
Yeah, it's interesting, Bob, because the two transfer portal wide receivers that they brought in are kind of polar opposites of each other. Yeah. Where Devontae Ross, in terms of the skill set, quick, shifty, explosive.
Yeah.
Also put up big numbers at a smaller program in Troy. You look at Kyron Hudson; he's more of the big 6'1", 210. Yeah. Sturdy type, kind of the big body target that you want. Played at a big program like USC, but didn't, he wasn't their highest producing receiver by any means there. The highlight reel is impressive. That one-handed catch against LSU in the opener last year. I remember watching that game and being like, who the hell is that? And you look him up and it's like, okay, that's Kyron Hudson. Catches a touchdown against Penn State, in that overtime win for the Nittany Lions back in October. So he's put it on tape. He's been productive. He hasn't been like this star quality player. Does Penn State need that necessarily? I think they just need more of a reliable presence, guy that Drew Aller knows he can go to. And just reading between the lines, like we haven't talked to really James Franklin or, Marcus Hagan's wide receivers coach about these two guys yet. And we'll learn a lot more once spring camp gets underway. But last week, Chuck Losey, strength and conditioning coach, he held an interview session, and our Max Ralph got a quote on Kyron Hudson from Chuck Losey, the strength and conditioning coach. Hudson has a pro mentality. He's got a veteran presence, a very mature, fluid, and good football player. It's tough to tell early, right? Like judging from just workouts and stuff. But, that if you have a tone setter in the room, that helps. And that seems like Kyron Hudson, could be that guy for Penn State's wide receivers.
Yeah, Johnny, they were saying similar things, pro mentality, veteran approach. They were saying a lot of the same things about Jalen Kimber last year, who was a veteran player. And when you hear that, you're like, well, what does that mean? Like the first time you hear that, you're like, is that good, or you don't have anything better to say about it? But
yeah,
that's what Jalen Kimber was. Like he showed up, plug and play, and he was one of the better corners right out of the gate. And I think I would take that as an encouraging sign from Chuck Losey. That's not a negative when you're not you're not lavishing praise. Penn State is at the point where they need proven players they can trust, given what they're returning. And I think what Chuck Losey says should be, Penn State fans should take that as an encouraging sign. Before we continue, I just wanted to run through real quick what Penn State has done in the transfer portal and why I think there's a pretty good chance that a bunch of these guys could impact the team. So 2021, Arnold Ebiketie was unbelievable coming from Temple. Even Johnny Dixon from South Carolina, you could make the argument he had, I think it was 3 solid years as a corner at Penn State. 2022 Chop Robinson. I don't know that I need to say much more about him. Hunter Norzad, the Ivy League player. I thought, what a great find and what they were able to do with him. And then you're talking about like wideouts that maybe they don't necessarily need a guy that can catch 80 passes and just be like the focal point of the passing game. But if he could, if Hudson could be like Mitchell Tinsley was in 2022, like he wasn't a flashy player, but he was a guy that made a lot of clutch catches in big spots all throughout the season. He was a much more productive. I think he was a hilltopper at Western Kentucky, but that's not what Penn State needs. They just need somebody on 3rd down and 8 that Drew can trust. And so you just wonder about Hudson. So 2023, Audavian Collins, I think, has really starting to come into his own. Even Riley Thompson, the punter. I mean, you could say, well, he's a special teams guy, but this will be his 3rd-year starter. And kind of sneaky, Alonzo Ford still on the roster, started to flash last year. I don't know what his status is, I think, health-wise, but I think he was coming on at the end of last year. And in 2024, also good. A.J. Harris, Jalen Kimber, and Nolan Rucci. So I guess the point is, usually when they go for somebody, they feel really good about it. And the staff that they have a plan to develop them. None of them are knuckleheads. And, we're talking about 6 guys. I mean, history says that several of them are going to help Penn State this year.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. And you look at that history and every player you rattled off, from Chop Robinson to Riley Thompson, like has made an impact at Penn State. Worth noting too, though, like, and specifically at the wide receiver position, where you said several of these guys will make an impact. It's likely that 1 or 2 won't,
Right.
because we've seen at the wide receiver position, them try to figure that out over the last few years. Dante Cephas, Malik McLean, Julian Fleming was a pro in the room and was like the elder statesman, but he wasn't a game changer as a pass catcher for Penn State last year, even though he was a great blocker on the outside, great blocker. But I think what you said though, Bob, about Mitchell Tinsley, I was a huge Mitchell Tinsley fan. I mean, he had like over 50 catches, almost 600 yards, 5 touchdowns in 2022, and was a big piece of that offense for Sean Clifford to lean on, especially on 3rd down, especially in high leverage moments. And if Kyron Hudson, and you hear Chuck Losey talking about him being a pro, being a vet, if he can be that, for Penn State's offense, and then you got Devontae Ross running around causing problems. You got Luke Reynolds stretching the field, running people over. Maybe you bring in another wide receiver in the spring transfer portal window when that opens in April, then you're cooking with something there.
Yeah.
But I do think, like, coming out of spring camp, the thing is with a lot of those, transfer portal guys that you mentioned, a lot of them came in January or December, whatever it was, and made an impact right away in spring camp. And you knew going into the fall, the coaching staff knew going into the fall that they could be relied upon. So, it's something just to keep in mind for us and for everyone when our readers are reading stuff about, transfer portal players who might be impressing James Franklin and the position coaches. They're not just going to say that, this early. They're not like those guys transferred in. It's not like they have to talk them up so they don't transfer out unless you're Storm Duck. If they're talking nicely about you in spring, it's a good sign.
Yeah. Moving right along here on the Blue White Breakdown, one player that I'm curious to get your thoughts on, and it's still very early, but I don't know. I kind of think a low key, not a question mark, but a kind of a position of need given who is back and the lack of it is defensive tackle. Only because it was great. If Zane Durant didn't come back, I might think that defensive tackle would be kind of close to wideout in terms of, boy, I don't know. But having him healthy and back is huge. But I do remember at the end of last year, once Ford got hurt and Hakeem Beamon left the team, I think it was during the second half of the season, maybe after the Wisconsin game, they were essentially playing with 3 defensive tackles inside. And that does not bode well. If you need to have 4 or 5 to kind of last through a long season. And the Waffle kid from Michigan, you read his about his past, and some people kind of looked at him a little bit as possibly an edge player, but you look at his size. He's a big boy. I think he's over 280 pounds. To me, that screams inside player. And I do think, even though Penn State likes some of its young interior defensive linemen, they probably need, and you don't know about Ford, right? They probably need this guy to be a guy that can push, at the very least, push if he's healthy for a spot in the top 4 or 5. No?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it has to be someone, right? Either Owen Wafel or
Yep.
Ty Blanding. Caleb Artis is in the
Yep.
room. We've mentioned and we talked a lot about Xavier Gilliam being a possible spring breakout candidate as a second-year player. You need someone next to Zane Durant. And like you mentioned, Bob, if Zane Durant had left, man, they might have taken the Jim Knowles contract money and put it towards D tackle in the portal, honestly, because they would have been in rough shape. But whoever you have next to Zane Durant, ideally a bigger body, more of a run stuffer, with Zane and his explosiveness as a pass rusher. I mean, like, if you can find that, great. It could be Owen Wafel, it could be Blanding, it could be Artis, it could be Ford. Again, like, we don't know his status right now. It's still kind of up in the air, after he suffered a long-term injury, at late in the year, and, he might be back, he might not. I don't know. But whoever it is, Deion Barnes has his work cut out for him this spring in identifying who will be the next Zane Durant, in 2026, or, the guy who will spell him when needed, because Zane Durant can't play every snap in the world, but, more importantly, who's going to be lining up next to him.
Yeah. So let's close with this here on the blue-white breakdown. So I think when you look at Penn State, like the construction of its roster, there is talent. There's talent at every position. It's just a question of the experience. But I think when you look at the defense, and you just look at them going into spring, I think the best individual talent on the defense, right? It's Deny, it's Zane Durant, and you could mention 2, 3, maybe even 4 corners. But it's kind of weird because that could be a really good defense, but at defensive end, at defensive tackle, you could argue even at linebacker and maybe even safety, depending on how King Mac kind of progresses. They have they need to kind of feel good about themselves, the coaching staff, coming out of spring. Whereas at the offense, even though they're missing Tyler Warren and there's some questions about wideouts, they have 2 veteran wideouts coming in, and they've got 2 elite running backs. They've got a quarterback who potentially could be a first-round pick. Even the offensive line, and even in the tight end room, they have 3 guys that probably are the sum of those parts. The drop off might not be that significant. So when you look at the offense and the defense, they're kind of in different positions going into spring. And as good as the individual talent is on defense at some positions, I might feel a little bit better about the offense right now.
Yeah, and also that's a byproduct of having Andy Kotelnicki back as your offensive coordinator. So in terms of the stability, right, quarterback, 2 running backs, most of your offensive line, and then the guy who could have been a head coach after the season, had an interview with West Virginia. I know there was other G5 interest in him as well. Andy Kotelnicki, after coming over from Kansas in his first year, did a great job as the play caller, and him being back is massive, for the offense, for the program, for their 2025 national title hopes. On the other end, like Jim Knowles, obviously, arguably the best defensive coordinator in the country, and Penn State is paying him as such, but there's still a transition phase there. And we've heard, in terms of the specificities and nuances of his defense, how long that might take to install. And so you have that on top of some moving pieces, losing a Kobe King in the heart of your defense, losing Jalen Reed, a leader of the defense, losing Abdul Carter, just the game wrecker of all game wreckers. We have a lot of talent coming back, but there is some fluidity there and some question marks there and some things to figure out. And that's what they're going to be doing really over spring camp. And not everything will be solved. It's one of those where in the summer, quarterback and wide receiver can build rapport over the summer, going out, throwing on the field and everything else on their own time. It's a little more difficult, I feel like, for defense. But so there's still going to be things that are going to be figured out in training camp. There's still going to be things that are going to be figured out in September, when they have that easy run into Big Ten play. But I mean, I trust Jim Knowles to figure it out. I trust those position coaches. You talk about continuity. Anthony Poindexter, Terry Smith, Dan Connor has been integral to that staff now, and Deion Barnes. So you trust that group will figure it out. But definitely I would feel better about the offense too, Bob, going into spring camp.
Yeah, and so as we kind of wrap this one up, Johnny, let's just recap. We started out just talking about the transfer portal, and it's really a half a dozen guys: Devontae Ross, Kyron Hudson, the wideouts from Troy and USC, King Mack, the safety from Alabama, Owen Waffle. We think interior defensive lineman from Michigan, 2 A&M kids, Eni White, Imhotep kid, who's an edge rusher coming off an injury, and then TJ Shanahan. We didn't talk a lot about him, but I think this year with their offensive line, I don't know what the expectation would be for a guy like that. But that's 6 names, and I'm just saying, Johnny, if it's me, and I'm not a math whiz, but 6 names, if they can go for this year, assuming good health, to help this year, if they can go 4 for 6, that would be like 667. That would be huge, I think, for this team. And I think we know the players that we're talking about. We're probably talking about Ross, Hudson, Mack, and then maybe one of the defensive linemen. And that would just be, to me, that would be incredible just because of what they've been able to do in the transfer portal. There's probably going to be some years where they don't go, wildly successful. But to hit on that many players when you don't bring that many kids in, I just think maybe one of the more overlooked parts of the Penn State football program is how they approach the portal, how they don't really waste a lot, I think, time or money in the portal. And I think, if Penn State's going to be compared to Ohio State and Michigan for being all in on the season approach, probably accurate. But I think more teams might want to do what Penn State's doing in the portal just because it seems like it's working.
Bobby took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say the same thing. And you mentioned, if they hit on 4 out of 6 of those guys as impact players in 2025, I was even going to say like 3 out of 6. Like I think they would take. Sure. And I think most college coaches, if you're bringing in like a small group of transfers, if you can hit on half of them, and I think that's generally, I mean, I didn't, I haven't analyzed every team and every transfer possible, but if you're getting a hit rate of 50% on the portal, I think that's actually pretty good. The problem is when you're a Florida State, say, and you portal in like seemingly your entire team. And if you have a 50% hit rate, then half your team is bad. And you have what happened last year, right? Like the teams that rely too heavily on the portal, it's thin ice, right? It's on a razor's edge. But if you're Penn State and your bread and butter is still high school recruitment and development, which is what it is, and I think which it will continue to be moving forward. It's just about plugging those gaps. It's about trying to bring in 5, 6, maybe 7 or 8 guys, depending on who they might bring in April, and hitting on a handful of them that bring you something that you didn't already have, and not relying on the portal for your success year in and year out. And so I think it's the right approach to take. If you're James Franklin, if you're Pat Kraft, the AD, and all that, all together with the program. And I think they're in a good spot this year. I think they are. I do think we'll be talking about another wide receiver in April coming in. I would be surprised if we're not. But for now, I like this group.
Yeah, I'm just laughing because I'm just remembering what Pat Kraft said at some point in his press. He basically said, and he was not. He made it. It was pretty clear he was not talking about the current roster. That if they could, they were going to take a big swing. I don't know who's available, but that to me would be fascinating to see how that plays out. Johnny, great talking with you as always on the Blue White Breakdown. We are just so close to spring practice. I can't wait. And we'll be back as always with more Blue White Breakdown podcasts. You guys stay out of trouble and we'll try and do the same thing.